You know, I only got this jacket probably about a couple of months ago. Haven't really had much of an opportunity to wear it during the summer, even though it is pretty lightweight. The funny thing is that, considering that it's got a military-esque styling, it's not entirely accurate, obviously. But there were some patches on the shoulders, most of which I've taken off, just weren't really my thing. There was an actually American flag patch, which is kind of funny because I'm Canadian. But I think it's about time that, given this jacket, I might as well wear it during a movie review and actually talk about a war movie for once. Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today, in another unscripted movie review, we're going to be talking about the newest film from Christopher Nolan, Dunkirk. I think if you take a look to a lot of guys, especially guys my age, in the 21st century, and ask them to name a filmmaker for which they admire and like most, I bet a lot of them would say Christopher Nolan, and it's not entirely surprising as to why. If you take a look at a lot of his films, there's a certain hyper-masculine, logic over emotion, actually logic and structure and duty over pretty much everything that has run through a lot of his films, and for a lot of guys, that's a pretty powerful resonating force. And if you go into pretty much all of his films, like Memento and Insomnia and The Prestige, the Dark Knight trilogy, Inception, even to some points Interstellar, although not really because it was trying for an emotionality that I didn't think quite stuck the landing. A lot of these films are based upon guys on a mission or on some sort of deeply seated task, and neither brought down by their emotions or contradictions of duty or living forces of chaos and anarchy. Sometimes you get that defined force, and I think one thing that I think Christopher Nolan does not get enough credit for is a lot of the definitions of character that goes into these stories. The people who are actually facing the brunt of this chaos and raw emotionality, or obstacles that sort of brain cannot quite contextualize, the things that don't make sense. And the fact that Christopher Nolan can so handily construct these characters, even in broad archetypes, that can be pretty powerful to tell these sorts of very structured narratives. And hell, probably Inception is the biggest example, when you have all those interlocking layers of dreamscape nearly undone by that female presence in the mind, and yet walking out of it, there is some still form that was more of a layered metaphor for filmmaking itself. Layer upon layer upon layer of production and scripting. So what happens when you get a film that's a little bit less about that script, a little bit less about that architecture and puzzle box around it, at least on the surface, at least when it comes to the character's dialogue, and more about the concept of how the film is going to be structured and layered? Well, then you've got a film like Dunkirk. And I will say this right out of the gate, the story of Dunkirk from a World War II narrative is not an easy one to tell. The Dunkirk evacuation roughly took place over a couple of weeks at the coast of France, coming in right after Germany has pretty much steamrolled through the majority of Belgium and France, and it's a losing battle. It's an evacuation. There are hundreds of thousands of soldiers that are going to be quite literally driven into the sea if they don't get destroyers or something to ferry them back across the channel to get back to Great Britain. And there are not enough boats. And the big story here is getting those boats, being able to fight off the Luftwaffe, and with enough air support, and just getting those troops home, getting them out of there. The problem with that is that telling that sort of story over a week-long span of time, that would probably be more suited to like an HBO miniseries. It's the sort of film that I think a lot of people would just say, from a structural vantage point, would not really make sense. Here's where Christopher Nolan comes into play here, and the big twist to how this film is structured. And I think a lot of people have given him a lot of credit for it, but I'm going to dig into why it's both a good idea and yet a slightly hampering one. The first story is set among a bunch of maroon soldiers who are desperate to get off the mainland, and that takes place over a week of time. Then you have the story of a couple people on a boat, a family who's basically going out and making one last ditch chance to go out and then rescue whatever troops they can. That story takes place over a day. And then you have a squadron of 3 fighter pilots that are going out and making a last ditch cover run to drive off any dive bombers, any of the Luftwaffe, before any of those boats across the channel will get hit or sabotaged. That story takes place over an hour of time. And all these stories are nested inside each other. The week-long story, then you have the day-long story, and then you have the hour-long story. Here's the twist. All these stories have been sliced up and placed thematically across each other, so the time seems to jump piece by piece by piece until they all come into alignment at the one point in the third act climax. It's novel, I'll give Christopher Nolan that. In terms of structuring thematically, it makes a lot of sense. In terms of structuring the narrative so that the tension is constantly maintained, I think it's actually quite ingenious. In terms of being able so that each story has an effective arc and arriving at the same rough point dramatically, so that you don't have one arc that is ended off before the other, and that you get all your big actors having enough screen time, yeah, that makes sense too. I get why he did this. Here's the thing. When you realize that particular structure comes into play, once you wrap your head around it, you're then starting to see, okay, you're telling three arcs, you're telling three pretty broad narratives, and that broadness might work against the film's advantage. And this is where it gets a little bit tricky because, again, this is where I was asking, and as I stressed before, Christopher Nolan does have a skill at emphasizing and developing up character. And that doesn't really happen in this movie. It leans extremely heavily upon the actors playing these characters with the sparse lines that they have in order to flesh out some idea of that tension and hopelessness that they feel. Remember, they've got no backup coming. They have lost this fight. They need to be able to go home and rally again, and that sense of hopelessness is palpable. The problem is that when Christopher Nolan gives these characters so few lines, for all three main subsets of characters, it can make things feel a little thin, a little bit too heavily reliant upon archetypes and relying on the actors to elevate them and turn them into something more. Now, don't get me wrong, the actors really put through the paces here. In particular, Mark Rylance as that riverboat captain in order to haul people back. He does amazing work, basically trying to handle that stripped down, straight and proper, common Englishman fold that's able to make that one last ditch effort, really against everybody's proper objectives, including Cillian Murphy, who shows up as a shell-shocked soldier, and really kind of blew me away there just in terms of the subtlety of his performance. But then you also have characters like Kenneth Branagh, who you would expect giving a much showier performance than he actually does. He actually does really well in that particular role as that tier master, basically now having to stay behind in order to reconcile with the fact that it's effectively hopeless to get these people off. And then you have the few soldiers that are desperate enough, and really they have names but you're not going to remember them. And the one that I did recognize was Harry Styles, and frankly he was remarkably good in this terms of a role that requires him to emote and pushes his character into some dark territory, but at the same time, like, you wouldn't recognize him if you didn't know, for one. And for another, it's also a case where I wish his intensity felt more grounded in something that could have been explored a little bit more through dialogue, through a lot of these scenes, and through how a lot of this movie's visual language came together. And then you have Tom Harvey basically acting as the courageous British air pilot. And you know what? Credit to him for doing as much as he can, where he's got a face mask over most of his face. Yeah, that calls back a little bit to Mad Max Fury Road there. But at the same time, you got what Max Rockatansky's emotion was coming from a George Miller film. Whereas for Christopher Nolan, by obscuring so much of his face, which keeps happening in these characters with his particular character in Christopher Nolan films, it actually kind of mutes a lot of our emotional response when you're relying on him to carry an entire arc of part of that narrative, especially when he's running out of fuel. He doesn't know how much fuel he has, and he's pretty much doing a one-man flight in order to blow away any Luftwaffe bombers and fighters. And you know what? I will give Christopher Nolan a lot of credit for how he films a lot of this. It's a pretty bleak war movie in terms of the amount of water and oil and the slick gray metal of ships that are just toppling over, and the fire, and again, the water that explodes in, and the amount of dirt and a haggard desperation that translates through a lot of the visual language of this film. Even in some of the big hero shots, they do feel a little bit muted because, again, this is desperation. A lot of it is very much gray-scented duty. They're trying to do what they can, and the acknowledgement that most of them will not get out of this alive. And you could say it's a very British aesthetic when it comes to putting together a film like this, and the fact that this movie is so intently British and almost detached from presenting a lot of it, I can imagine it will resonate very strongly with that audience. My problem is that for as cleanly shot, for as dramatic as this movie is trying to be, for as heavily as it relies on a score from Hans Zimmer that constantly has that ticking that is emphasized in the background in order to intensify and up that tension, the fact that how much this movie relies on that score when so much of the film is shot with vast empty stretches of water and land in order to emphasize the smallness of these characters. Again, Christopher Nolan's command of the visual language is good, but there's a couple inaccuracies that got a little bit distracting, not the least being you do feel somewhat detached from these desperate characters, these desperate men, when they're given so little dialogue, and basically a lot of it falls into, well, we have to follow orders, we have to get out of this, we have to go home, and it tries a little bit to intensify the moral drama and add some shades of ambiguity, but it's a little hard to suck me in when you also have several competing narratives that are going directly full force, with probably Tom Hardy's being the simplest of all of them. And while there is some degree of complexity, again, it's not exactly as involving when the characters feel as thin or as archetypal as they are. Then you have the baffling choice to go for a PG-13. Here's the thing about Dunkirk, and I get that this probably makes sense when it comes to a Christopher Nolan movie, in that he's trying to emphasize the mechanical, the stiff, the duty-bound, and yet there's no blood at all. It's actually stunning when you have characters who die in this film, who suffer some pretty traumatic head injuries, who get lit on fire. And a lot of the injuries, a lot of the wounds, a lot of the trauma that would have occurred in this evacuation, it's not even shown. And it does take you out of the movie a little bit when you realize that that does happen. And it gets even more stark. You don't see German fighters in this movie. And I get the reason why it was presented more as an impalpable threat, something that you know is there but you can't see because it's behind sniper fire, or it's behind a war machine that is just not quite there in order to intensify that tension. The things that you don't see becomes all the scarier. I get that. But it also becomes the point where you need to show something. You need to be able to pivot, otherwise the tension just lies at a flat line and doesn't escalate no matter how much sawing on the strings your orchestra does. And again, when you have such archetypes, they can work providing they are framed in a way that allows you to empathize with the characters, allows you to get a little bit more into what those characters are thinking, allows show a little bit more subtlety and complexity, lean on that acting a little bit. The problem is that Christopher Nolan is shooting with big-ass IMAX cameras where a lot of the shots will pan out to wide shots, and you don't tend to get those levels of acting subtlety that would otherwise come through. And yes, I get that it's a war movie and a lot of these characters are designed to be archetypes. But at the same time, when you have that, there's still ways that you can emphasize the emotional drama and tension without just relying so heavily on the fact that this is a thing that happened, I am showing it for you all, take it in as you will, and when the musical score comes up, be sad or be otherwise inspired. I don't know, guys, like, I want to like this movie, but there's a part of me that feels a little detached from it. And it relies on the fact that Christopher Nolan isn't relying on character in the same way that he did with Cobb and Inception, or he did with Harvey Dent coming out of The Dark Knight, or he did it out from Gary Oldman's characters in the entire Dark Knight trilogy. Like, there was an anchor point, and I just wasn't getting it in Dunkirk the same way. I was trying, like, their characters, they do a fair amount there, but when you're looking for the thematic underpinning so much that this is just more filmed as if it is a historical documentary event with a neat framing structure in order to intensify the drama, I can almost see the gears working overtime behind the screen in order to put things all together. But when you remove certain things from the human experience of what actually happened in that historical event, the mechanical construction of the whole thing becomes a lot more apparent. And thus when you go for such soaring moments of human drama, they just don't hit the same way they could. Yeah, the score is powerful, but Hans Zimmer and some subtle acting work from Mark Rylance and Kenneth Branagh can only do so much here. Look, I know, I'm ragging on this movie probably more, and I get why people love it. I totally do. Because it's not going to make a Hollywood-esque story of a war, especially when a war scene that would not otherwise be covered by as much historical fiction. It wasn't American focused. Like, I totally get why this is a passion project for Christopher Nolan, and it's shot and constructed in a way that clearly makes it seem like it was a passion project. But it also feels like it's trying to do three different things. There was one interview that I read that suggested that Christopher Nolan wanted to make this a dialogue-free movie. And you know what? If he was going for that sort of bleak, harsh tone poem approach when it comes to that sort of war, I might actually be able to appreciate it more. It would make a little bit more sense. But the problem is when the dialogue constructs so many of these characters as archetypes, and yet we're still supposed to respond and cheer when you have big, broad set pieces, and yet all the more further while intensifying the scenes of desperation of war in which there's no blood. I don't know. I wish I had more of a connection to it, but all these elements seem to be working somewhat at cross purpose, and I can see the mechanism behind it so much more clearly. And yeah, that does kind of take you out of the film. Now, am I saying this is a bad movie? Of course not. I think a lot of the acting for what we get of it is pretty impressive. Again, Cillian Murphy, Mark Rylance, Harry Styles probably has a career in more movies. Good for him. He seems like the legitimate triple threat in that regard. I'll give him plenty of points for that. And you know what? As much as I kind of ragged on Tom Hardy for not being able to see a lot of his face and see him emote in the same way acting, he still does do an impressive job being that stalwart hero. I'll give him points for that. And you know what? I will say the film is shot beautifully. It's clear that Christopher Nolan put a lot of effort into the staging and architecture of this film. But when you see so much of the architecture, it doesn't suck me in the same way that Inception did or The Dark Knight did. And I'm going to be very blunt about that. As such, as much as I like this movie, I'm giving it a light 7 out of 10. And I know that is harsh, and I fully understand and accept that. But I wish I was emotionally pulled by this movie more, rather than just marveling at its construction. It has emotional pull to it, but that's because, just hold on for a second, because I've read this. It's a John Keegan book about the Second World War, and it's actually pretty alarmingly comprehensive in describing all these initiatives. It honestly feels a little bit like Christopher Nolan read this book or read any real study about what happened at Dunkirk and tried to film it as much historical accuracy as possible, except when it's not, in order to intensify tensions, because indeed he's a filmmaker. And you know what? I get filming a book, I get making that sort of adaptation of real events, but for a story with so much potential to draw out that level of human drama, when in reality you have so many stoic, stone-faced characters that are, even the ones who are shell-shocked, are barely emotive at all. It's a little hard to get invested in the story. I wish I could more, but at the end of the day, Dunkirk leaves me colder than it should. It was good, you'll probably enjoy it, but I'm not seeing the high praise that so many else have given it. That's just it. Sorry. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I know this will probably annoy some of you. Again, I'm a bit of a historical movie fan, so I get why Christopher Nolan made this movie, and I can tell that it was a passion project, and I can tell the amount of core to the story. You can tell he feels a connection to this work, an emotive connection. I just wish that beyond the construction and beyond the obviously choreographed moments in order to trigger that connection, that we got more of it and that it was framed better in order to emphasize some of those moments coming out of the acting, which in the most part it doesn't quite do as much as I would otherwise like. I think it's a good movie, again, not a great one. But hey, if you guys have any opinions beyond that, happy to hear it in the comments. If you guys want to get involved in my scheduling so I don't cover this movie 2 weeks after its release, link to my Patreon right there, where 3 times a week you guys get to vote on my schedule, and once a week you guys get to add records or movies to my schedule. More details right there, but till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.